Director S. Seth Cavill had a gift for presenting other people's work, as though the ideas had arrived fully formed inside his own head. He had been doing it for 26 years across 4 research postings, and in that time he had developed a refined technique. He never explicitly claimed credit. He simply spoke in the first person. He said, "I found," when he meant my staff found. And "my analysis suggests," when the analysis had been completed by someone 2 pay grades below him. And "the method I applied," when the method had been described to him that morning in a corridor conversation, and had been invented by someone who was now sitting quietly in the second row of the briefing room, waiting to hear how it went. As Seth Cavill was not a bad researcher in his own right. He had genuine expertise in xenobiological survey methodology, an impressive publication record, and the kind of institutional authority that came from decades of careful positioning. He was also, in the particular way of people who have operated this way for long enough, genuinely unaware that anything was wrong. He had absorbed the contributions of his staff so many times that he had stopped tracking the boundary between what was his and what was not. He presented now as a person who believed that the ideas of the people working under him were, in some meaningful sense, extensions of his own thinking. He had paid for the lab. He had hired the staff. He had created the conditions in which the work happened. The conclusions were therefore, in a reasonable operational sense, his. None of this was what Mara Celes was thinking about when she sat down in the second row of the Yavith Station research briefing room at the start of the 3rd review cycle. She was 23 years old, 7 months into her first off-world posting, and she was thinking about the calibration problem. The calibration problem was why Director S. Seth Cavill was presenting today. The Yavith Station xenobiology program had been attempting, for the better part of 2 years, to establish a reliable field measurement protocol for organic decay markers in the deep stratum sediment cores that the station's drilling teams had been extracting from the planet's 3rd equatorial zone. The problem was that the existing decay marker analysis tools, all of them, every version currently in use across the Compact's xenobiology research network, had been calibrated for planetary environments with atmospheric oxygen concentrations within a relatively narrow range. Yavith 3 had an atmospheric composition that sat outside that range in 2 separate parameters, and the result was that every measurement the existing tools produced was systematically offset by an amount that varied unpredictably depending on core depth, extraction temperature, and local mineral content. This meant that 2 years of sediment core data was, at best, directionally indicative and at worst meaningless. The review committee of the Yavith Xenobiology Consortium had arrived today specifically to assess whether the program's methodology was sound enough to justify continued funding. The problem had been known for 14 months. The solution had been found 11 days ago. Mara had found it on a Thursday afternoon, working alone in the secondary analysis room after the rest of the lab staff had finished their shift. She had been running the numbers on a comparison study, a side project she had started independently, not assigned, not directed, done because she was curious, and she had noticed a pattern in the offset variance that nobody had been looking for because nobody had been asking the question she had been asking. She had written it up, brought it to Director S. Seth Cavill the following morning, spent 40 minutes explaining it, answered his questions, watched him sit very still in the manner of a person processing something significant, and then been thanked and sent back to her analysis station. The write-up was thorough. The methodology was her own. The core insight, that the offset could be modeled as a compound function of extraction temperature gradient and local iron sulfide concentration, both of which were already being recorded in the drilling team's field logs and had simply never been cross-referenced against the analysis output, was hers entirely. She had not been listed on the briefing agenda. Director S. Seth Cavill stood at the front of the room in front of the committee. He was tall even for his species. The Sci were a scaled, long-limbed species whose particular build tended to give them an air of architectural authority in spaces designed for shorter beings, and he wore his seniority with the ease of someone who had been the most important person in most rooms for a very long time. The committee was 3 individuals, one from the Compact Research Allocation Office, one from the Yvith Station Administrative Authority, and one from the consortium's External Scientific Review Board. They had traveled a considerable distance for this briefing, and they were prepared to be either impressed or not impressed, which was the normal disposition of committees reviewing programs that were having methodology problems. The core difficulty, S. Seth Cavell said, with the fluid authority he brought to all presentations, was always the offset variance. Standard calibration frameworks assume an atmospheric parameter set that Yvith 3 does not match. What my analysis revealed is that the variance is not random, it is compound and predictable. Specifically, it is a function of extraction temperature gradient and local iron sulfide concentration, both of which we have been recording in the field data for the duration of the program. He brought up the methodology display. Mara recognized every line of it because she had written every line of it. By applying a correction function derived from the relationship between these 2 variables, S. Seth Cavell continued, we can retroactively recalibrate the full 2-year dataset. The result is a clean, reliable measurement record that is fully compatible with Compact standard comparative analysis. The program's prior data is not lost. It is, in fact, intact and usable. The committee member from the External Review Board, a broad-shouldered individual with the kind of expression that suggested he had heard many confident presentations and had learned to reserve judgment, said, "When did you arrive at this correction function?" 11 days ago, S. Seth Cavell said. I was reviewing the cross-program data in the secondary analysis records when the relationship became apparent. Mara wrote something in her work pad. She did this quietly, with no particular change in her expression. The word she wrote was reviewing. The external reviewer looked at the methodology display. He was an experienced scientist, and what he was doing with the display was the same thing experienced scientists always did, which was look for the reasoning behind the reasoning. After a moment he said, "This is an elegant solution. The compound function approach to the offset model is not one I have seen applied to atmospheric deviation cases before. It is the kind of insight that tends to arrive from someone who has been looking at the data from an unusual angle." That is a generous description, S. Seth Cavell said, in the comfortable way of someone receiving a compliment they feel is appropriate. What was the unusual angle? A pause, brief, but there. I ran a comparison with the drilling team field logs as a secondary cross-reference to the analysis output. The relationship was in the correlation. A comparison you initiated independently, or a standard review protocol. An independent comparative review. It was not part of the standard workflow. Mara wrote, an independent comparative review. She had been wondering since she sat down whether she was going to say anything. She had made a decision on her walk to the briefing room that she was not going to make a scene, not going to make accusations in front of the committee, not going to do anything that would damage the program or embarrass anyone publicly in a way she could not support. She had a great deal of respect for the work the program was trying to do, and she understood that S. Seth Cavell was not, in his own framing, lying. He was presenting in his characteristic first person. He was presenting work that he thought of as an extension of his direction. She had also, on the same walk, sent a message through the station's research communication log, the formal system, the one that timestamped everything and was automatically archived to the compact research record, to the external reviewer's registered contact address. The message contained the original write-up, her name on it, dated, timestamped from the morning she had brought it to S. Seth Cavell. It contained the 11 days of working notes she had kept in the secondary analysis system, all time-stamped, all logged to her staff credentials. It contained the original data comparison files, generated by her station access codes, with a clear metadata trail showing who had opened what and when. She had sent it 40 minutes before the briefing started. She had not, she was fairly certain, done anything that could be described as making a scene. The external reviewer glanced once at the secondary screen built into the committee table. He had the look of a person who had just received a message at a not entirely expected moment and was deciding how to proceed with a briefing that was already in progress. He proceeded by asking in the same measured tone, "Director, the methodology document you presented, when was it drafted?" "I formalized it for the briefing over the last week," Seth Cavell said. "The core analysis preceded the formal write-up." "There is a version in your station's research archive dated 16 days ago," the external reviewer said, "under a staff credential, not yours." The room was quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of an empty room or the quiet of a waiting room, but the quiet of a room in which a number of people had understood, simultaneously, that a particular kind of conversation had just begun. As Seth Cavell looked at the committee table, he did not look at Mara. He looked at the committee table the way you look at something when you are deciding, in real time, which direction a situation is moving, and whether there is any version of it that goes the way you assumed it would. "The archive document," he said, with the careful precision of someone choosing their words with much greater attention than they had been using 30 seconds ago, "is a preliminary draft that a staff member prepared at my direction. I incorporated it into the methodology framework." "At your direction," the external reviewer said, "was it documented as a directed task?" "The direction was informal, a corridor discussion." "The metadata on the archive document," the external reviewer said, consulting his secondary screen without particular urgency, "indicates it was opened exclusively under that staff credential for a period of 6 hours prior to its submission to your inbox. The submission to your inbox is also logged. The timestamp shows the draft was completed and submitted before you had opened the relevant data comparison files. This was the kind of specific that corridors and informal conversations could not account for." "I see," Seth Cavell said. The committee member from the Research Allocation Office, who had been quiet and attentive, and who had the additional quality of someone who spent considerable professional time examining paper trails, said, "Director, I would like to understand the full attribution for the methodology before we proceed with the program assessment. It is relevant to the committee's evaluation." She paused in the particular way of someone who has made a polite request that is actually a firm one. Perhaps the staff member who prepared the preliminary document should be present. Myra was already in the room. She said from the second row, in the tone of someone making a minor administrative clarification, "I'm here." 4 heads turned, as Seth Cavell turned last. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of someone who had just understood, fully and completely, a thing they had been in the process of not understanding for several days. "Mara Celis," the external reviewer said, looking at his screen. 7 months on the Yvith Station program. The archive file and the working notes are both under your credentials." "Yes," Mara said. "Walk me through how you arrived at the compound function." She did. She was thorough, she was clear, and she kept her voice at the same administrative register she had used to announce that she was in the room. She explained the comparison study she had run independently, the pattern she had noticed, the reasoning that had led her from the pattern to the offset model, and the process of testing and verifying it against the existing dataset. She answered questions from all 3 committee members. She was in the middle of explaining the specific mechanism by which the iron sulfide concentration variable had been identified, when she noticed that the committee member from the allocation office had started making the kind of notes that were not summary notes, but the other kind. Director S. Seth Cavill stood slightly to the right of the display screen through all of this, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a person who is present in a room and at the same time would prefer not to be. The external reviewer listened to the full explanation before he said anything, which Mara appreciated because it meant he was actually listening and not waiting for the first gap in which to speak. When she finished, he said, "This is original work. The compound function is specifically creative. It is not a standard derivation from existing methodology. It is a new approach, and it is correct. The data I reviewed in the message you sent, and I want to note for the record that I received supporting documentation prior to the briefing began, fully supports the attribution." "I was going to mention that I sent it," Mara said. "I wanted the record to be complete before the assessment began." "A reasonable approach," the external reviewer said, in the tone of someone who found it more than reasonable. The committee member from the allocation office stopped making notes, looked at Director S. Seth Cavill, and said, in a voice that carried the flat weight of institutional attention, "The methodology itself is sound. The attribution, however, will need to be corrected in the program documentation before the funding decision is finalized." She paused. "We will also need a brief conversation with the director, separately, before we conclude today's review." As Seth Cavill said, "Of course," in the voice of a person standing very still in a room that had arranged itself around him in a formation he had not anticipated. The external reviewer made a final note, set down his stylus, and looked at Mara with the professional directness of someone who was about to say something that would take less than 5 seconds and did not need preamble. "For the formal record," he said, "the correction function for the YIVA 3 atmospheric offset is credited to Celis, M., Junior Research Associate, YIVA Station Xenobiology Program, Cycle 17, Day 41. The methodology document will be re-archived under her credentials as primary author." He looked at S. Seth Cavill. "The director's contribution will be noted as program oversight." S. Seth Cavill received this in the specific silence of someone for whom silence was the only available response. Mara wrote one last thing in her work pad. She wrote it without looking up, in the same small letters she had been using throughout, at the bottom of the page below reviewing and an independent comparative review. She wrote "correction filed." Then she closed the pad and waited for the committee to tell her what they needed next.